Let's see how we can create our own concatMap operator for RxJS. So let's take a look at our test first. In our test, I'm creating an observable, and that observable is going to emit a next event immediately, one after 30 milliseconds, before completing after 50 milliseconds. Then we apply the concatMap operator. concatMap takes in a function and it applies that function to every next event. And that function is always going to return an observable. But instead of passing the observable to the next observer, which in our case is the subscribe block, the concatMap operator is going to subscribe to that observable, and I'm going to refer to this subscription as the inner subscription. And whenever that inner subscription emits a next event, that next event will be sent to our subscribe block. So that is what a flattening operator does. But what's specific about the concatMap operator is that it's only going to do this when the previous inner observable has completed. So whenever we get a next event, we map that to an inner observable, we subscribe to the inner observable, but let's say that that inner observable is still active and a new next event comes in from the source. It is again going to be mapped to an observable, but it's not going to be subscribed to until the first inner observable has completed. So if we draw this out in a marble diagram, and let's say that we have a source observable that emits two next events, we can see that the first next event is mapped to an inner observable and it's subscribed to. So we can see the same values in the result observable. But when we have that second next event from the source and the first inner observable has not completed yet, then we do not subscribe to this observable yet, the second inner observable, until the first one has completed. So concatMap only subscribes to the next inner observable when the previous one has completed. So let's see how we can create our own concatMap operator to do exactly the same thing. And as you can see, I've already laid out the basic skeleton for an operator, which is a function taking in a source observable and returning a new observable. And then we map that then we subscribe to the source observable in that new observable, and we have a handler for the three types of events. So now, first I'm going to wrap our operator inside of another function, so our operator can take in that function that transforms next events into observables. Now, whenever we get a next event, we can use that function to map it to an inner observable. So when I call this function, I'm going to get back an inner observable. And whenever we have an inner observable, we are of course going to subscribe to it. And I'm going to add a handler for the next event. So whenever we have a next event from our inner observable, we are just going to send it to the next observer. Whenever we have an error event from our inner subscription, we're also just going to send that to the next observer. And whenever we have a complete event, we will need to do something else. So this is what flattening is, but of course we can only subscribe to the inner observable when there is no previous inner subscription active. So I'm going to create a variable here called inner sub active, which is going to start at false. And before we subscribe, we are going to check if there is no inner sub active. So if we don't have an active inner subscription, only then we are going to subscribe to the inner observable. And of course, when we get this, we're going to change this variable to true. So now we are only going to subscribe to the inner observable if there is no inner observable active. But let's say that there is an inner observable active, then we are going to hit our else case. And in that scenario, we need to keep a reference to that inner observable. So I'm going to create a queue variable here, which is going to be an array of observable of any. And we're going to start with an empty array. Now, whenever we have that, whenever we have the case that we get a new next event, but the previous inner sub is still active, then we are going to push this variable onto the queue. So we can execute it later. Now, whenever the inner observable completes, then we need to do a couple of things. So first of all, we need to check, is there something on our queue? And to do that, I'm going to create a first variable here, and I'm going to say queue.shift to take out the first one. And then we can check, okay, if we have a first variable, so if we have a first variable, it means that something was on our queue, and it means we need to subscribe to that first variable. But this is basically the same thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of this and I'm going to create a new observable, and I'm gonna call this subscribe to inner. And this is going to take in an inner observable, which is an observable of type any. And in that function, we are going to subscribe. So we're going to say inner.subscribe. And now, whenever we get, so when we don't have an inner subscription active, we can say inner subscription active true, and then we can subscribe to the inner observable with our current mapped inner observable. And when that current inner observable completes, we check, is there something on our queue? And if there is something on our queue, we can call this same function. So we can say subscribe to inner, and we can pass in our next variable, which is on the queue. Now, if we don't have something on the queue, then we'll hit this else block, which means that we don't have anything new. Then we can just say that we don't have an inner sub active at this moment. So we're going to change this variable to false because we don't have an active one. And this is everything we need to do for the next event. So now let's go to the error event. So whenever we get an error from the source, we are just going to send it to the next observer. And whenever we get a complete event, we need to do something as well. So first of all, when we get a complete from the source, we need to check if there is an inner sub active. Because if there is an inner sub active, we cannot complete the observer yet. So if there is no inner sub active, then we can complete the observer. But if there is no inner subscription active yet, we still need to complete at some point. And the place where we're going to do this is whenever our last inner subscription is going to complete, and we check, is there something on our queue? Let's say there's nothing on the queue. Then we get the else block, and then we can check that if our outer subscription, so our source subscription, is still active, and if that's false, so if it's not active, then we need to complete as well. So I'm going to create another variable here, outer sub active, and this is going to start at true. So now whenever our source observable complete, we can say outer sub active is false. And then we can say, okay, if our inner observable completes, there is nothing on the queue yet, there is nothing on the queue anymore, and we have an inner outer subscription which is false, so it's not active anymore, then we also need to do observer.complete. So let's recap. Every time we get a next event, we map it to an inner observable. When there is no inner subscription active, we say that we are going to activate one and we subscribe to the inner observable, so as you can see here. But if there is an inner subscription active, we're going to keep a reference to that variable for later. Now, in this function, we subscribe to the inner observable. Whenever we get next and error events, we just send them to the observer. And whenever we get a complete, we check, okay, is there something on our queue? If there is, subscribe to it. Else, we're going to check, has our outer subscription completed yet? If so, we are going to complete this as well. And then the observable is finished. So whenever we get an error event from the source observable, we just send it to the next observer. And when we get a complete event from the outer observable, we check, is our inner subscription still active? Is an inner subscription still active? And then we can complete as well. And that is basically what concatMap does. So if we use our own operator inside of our test, we see that everything still works. If we remove one of the variables, we can see that it fails. If we add it again, we see that it works. Now, the only thing we still need to do is we need to clean up these inner subscriptions here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new variable, subscription, and this is going to be a new subscription object. And every new subscription object that gets created has an add method. So whenever we subscribe, I'm going to wrap this and I'm going to say subscription.add. And this means that we can add some teardown logic to the subscription object. So whenever we have this inner subscription here as well, we can also say subscription.add and pass in some teardown logic. And that is how you can create your own concatMap operator for RxJS.